I don't see maximum pressure as having worked. I think, in fact, it sort of emboldened the Iranians.
Neil, you recently published a collective paper on policy making in the GCC, states, citizens, and institutions. Could you tell us a bit more about the evolving role of institutions in decision making within the GCC states?
Sure. So my colleague Mark Thompson and I thought this would be a really interesting project because much of the analysis, either academic or policy, really focuses on individuals. It's all about the top leadership. And there's been very little focus on the role of institutions across the GCC states. And a lot of the literature that looks at decision making around the world is always about institutions. We learn how important institutions are. So we thought it's just lacking within the region. So we looked at education institutions, health institutions, we looked at the military, we looked at the role of e-governance, and importantly, we looked at the role of sort of informal institutions. And that was really where we sort of, we managed to sort of dig away and find a rich vein of research and insight. More formal institutions tend to take time to mature and actually play a functioning role within a broader decision-making structure, whereas some of the informal institutions, which have been there for quite some time or have emerged more naturally, have actually sort of started to play an informing role. So similarly to institutions we would say in the UK.
Okay, and why this recent evolution in the role of institutions?
I think simply because the states themselves are maturing, they're growing, they're expanding, and perhaps whereas in the past the focus was more domestic, we've seen a much wider and a bigger kind of, I guess, a global reach. So in order to sort of fulfill those ambitions or to support the growth in population, those institutions have naturally had to really sort of be created and set in stone. Whilst they started off quite small and their ambitions maybe were limited, we've seen capacities develop, and they themselves now need to be an important part of that kind of overall decision-making process.
A question on Iran. How do you see the US-Iran relationship evolving? I mean, has maximum pressure worked, and do you see a quote-unquote grand bargain as a viable outcome?
So I don't see maximum pressure as having worked. In fact, arguably, Iran is in a much stronger position now than it has been in the past. We saw it carry out its attacks against Abqaiq and Khurais, which demonstrated not only its capability, but also its ability to strike, right at the heart of the sort of Saudi kingdom and the crown jewels, as they've been called. And the timing was very instructive. Because change in oil minister, John Bolton had left government at that point. There was a confluence of times that seemed to suggest that the Iranians would strike at that particular moment. And irrespective of the protests in Lebanon or Iraq, I think the Iranians are feeling fairly confident and fairly buoyant at the moment, and so much so, they were able to strike down a US drone and without significant pushback on either of those fronts. So I don't see maximum pressure as having worked. I think, in fact, it sort of emboldened the Iranians.
Okay.
Nonetheless, there is a desire, I think, however shielded it is, from both sides, to actually get back to talks. Grand bargain is probably too much of a term. That's too big. That's too complex. But I do see the prospect of talks coming maybe in the next 4 or 5 months.
Okay. And do you see Europe playing a key role in those talks? Or do you see the possibility of European countries pursuing a new Iran deal actually without the United States?
No, I don't think the Iranians have I don't think the Europeans have the capacity, the political will, or desire to really take this process further without. Number one, they're too self-consumed with what's happening in Europe at the moment. There are too many issues, and Brexit obviously is one of those key issues as well that they need to address. There isn't unity right across the EU on how to adapt and how to approach this, and I think they would want to stay as best as they could in lockstep with the US, irrespective of the issues and problems. But the role that I do see the EU playing is more sort of taking on the mantle of helping develop a regional security framework. I think if the JCPOA can be kept alive, or there are talks to revive what the JCPOA was and work towards a 2.0 model, then I think the Europeans could fit within that framework and work with all the regional partners to try to, number one, de-escalate tensions in the region, but put together a security framework or architecture that can sort of resolve some of the wider regional issues.
So we're now 8 years into the Syrian conflict. According to you, what impact has it had on the wider stability of the Middle East?
So, I mean, the conflict in Syria, of course, it's a civil war, and at the same time, and it's sucked in, the regional powers. All of the regional powers at one point or another have been drawn into it. But more importantly, it's really brought the Russians to bear. It's really brought the Russians into the framework, and almost sort of, they've returned, not that they were ever massive, but they've certainly returned to the Middle East, and they've now got a military footprint, and they are, by and large, the backbone of the Assad regime, and they have guaranteed his survival, and will be instrumental in guaranteeing their longevity. The wider implications of that should be seen within the context of the question in and around whether the US is withdrawing from the region, or whether the US has been pivoting away from the region for some time. I think militarily it hasn't done, but I think from a diplomatic point of view, it's we've seen it slowly withdrawing, slowly retrenching back into the US, and the America first, or the Trump ambo over America first. And I think as a consequence of that, it's the regional players that have sort of moved in to fill that vacuum within Syria, and we've seen the Russians moving in to fill that vacuum. And to me, that's the wider implication, is that now it is, as one of my colleagues, Chris Phillips, he's written a book on this called The Struggle for Syria. It really is about the struggle, or the war in Syria, not just being about the domestic struggle, but about bringing in the wider players. And I think that's the longer term implications.